I had the pleasure of recently talking to Mr. Rakesh Ranjan. Rakesh Ranjan is the business head of Hyperpure, the B2B business supply business of Zomato. So let me ask the following question to Mr. Rakesh Ranjan. There are several reports that speak to the potential of the gig economy and its potential to contribute to the Indian economy itself more so than before. One report, for example, suggests that the platform-based gig economy has the potential to grow to about 455 billion at a CAGR of about 17% by 2024. Another report says that the gig economy has the potential to serve up about 90 million jobs. That is roughly about 30% of India's non-farm workforce and adding up to 1.2% to India's GDP in the long run. Right? This is really huge. The question to Mr. Rakesh Ranjan is that how did this all start? What were the major pivots that enabled this platform-based gig economy to be a real engine of growth and employment in India?
Sure. Thanks, Anand, for the question. I think the key lies in the word that you mentioned, which is platform gig economy. And I think that's been the biggest pivot. The rise of platforms to be able to connect the consumer to a set of sellers, where the gig economy worker does the last mile, actually has been the largest pivot. Of course, a lot of this has happened in the last 5 years, a lot more. And one of the sectors that has been largely responsible for that is the food delivery sector. If you look at in its various avatars, the gig economy was existing before the likes of Zomato or a Swiggy or a Food Panda came in as well. But it was not on a platform, and hence there was a lot of asymmetry of information that existed for a gig economy worker at that point of time to understand how much money he will make, how much time does he or she needs to work. The first thing that the platform did is to be able to create a platform where this asymmetry of information reduced. And I think that's the first and the largest pivot, the rise of platform players in the country. Second, it is slightly linked to technology. As the smartphone penetration increased, the ability of a worker to become a gig economy worker multiplied several times. And hence their ability to log into an app-based system, log in at the time of their choice, because connectivity or infrastructure was no longer an issue, that got resolved. And third is where I think the biggest pivot has come is societal acceptance of gig economy workers themselves. If I talk about 2017-18, being a gig economy worker was not considered a job per se. And I think that transformation has happened a lot during the pandemic, because gig economy workers started getting seen as people who are actually helping each one of us in carrying out our daily tasks. I think that was a big behavior change, and that led to a lot of acceptance of gig economy workers as a core part of the economy. And once that level of respect came about is when we have seen exponential growth in terms of course, societal acceptance, but also in terms of the employable workforce to take gig economy as a formal source of employment.
That's a great answer. Notice the two reasons for the growth of the industry. The first one is the alleviation of information asymmetry, just more transparent information on both the buyer as well as the seller side. So let me call it as the demand and the supply side. That is, providing enough information on both sides of the platform enables better matching of demand with supply. Mr. Rakesh, let me ask you another question. You had mentioned that the platform-based gig economy is now expanding to other sectors as well. In the future, which sectors will we see the gig economy, the platform-based gig economy operating successfully?
So gig economy, Anand, right now exists in multiple shapes and forms. It started a lot with taxis. It then moved on to platforms in terms of this food delivery, in terms of Zomato, Swiggy, Food Panda, Uber Eats at some point in time. And right now it exists in very unheard and very different professions as well. For example, even in warehousing these days, gig economy is quite pervasive. So now people have taken that as an approach and been able to apply it to their own needs in multiple facets, which works most probably for the platforms and also for the workers.
That's a great point. Notice that the emphasis on sectors that would likely allow for flexibility, right? Flexible working hours, flexible participation by the labor or the workforce itself, and sectors that will also have huge variation or huge demand surges very frequently as well. These two aspects of a particular sector make it very ideal for the platform-based gig economy to operate. Let me ask you another question. On the firm side, what might explain why the industry is concentrated?
Anand, if you see, there are a few underlying principles for the gig economy per se, which means sectors which have short durations of work, have a lot of flexibility, and but in that short duration, the work is intensive enough for one to be able to reap the benefits of almost a full time formal employment. And the moment you sort of take that and you look at what sectors where there will be peaks of demand, where there will be flexibility of demand, there are only a few sectors that come up, which is, again, if you look at taxi as a use case in the country, uh, a lot of travel happens during the morning and the evening parts. If you look at food delivery, most of the transactions happen at lunch and dinner. And that is why you see a much higher concentration of gig workers in these sectors. If you look at, let's say, if I was to theoretically say, um, let's say, working as HR in a particular firm, now there may not be a lot of flexibility during the whole day in terms of when you want to work, in terms of both the timing as well as duration, and you might be required for the whole time. When you're required for the whole time, um, gig might not work out to be the best strategy for you as well as for the work. So I think that is why you see a lot more concentration in these sectors as compared to others.
What are the entry barriers in the platform-based gig economy industry?
So the way to sort of understand this is to divide into two phases. One is the initial setup phase, and then is a little more steady state phase. The ability to create a platform itself requires a certain level of capital, not only in terms of money as a capital, but also in terms of resource as a capital. So, for one to be able to set up a platform which is at a certain level of, let's say, user experience, has a certain level of marketplace presence or penetration, whichever way we define it, that is not a very low capital um, setup. So there is a first level filter that happens on that itself. But even having said that, if you look at food delivery as a sector and you go 5 years back, there were tons of platforms like that. There were regional platforms, there were national platforms, and I think at the peak of 2017, there were at least 25 to 30 platform food delivery players in the country. So at the first level, there's a lot of filtering that happens because of, as I said, technology capital, human capital, as well as actual capital, which makes it less, I would say, less crowded to begin with. What makes platforms the hardest is the ability to go from initial setup to scale. Because for multiple reasons. One, um, it is a most platforms are two-sided networks, which means you need to get the right number of customers, and you need to get also a large number of sellers on the platform if you're operating as a marketplace. Or if you're operating in an inventory platform, then you need a large set of customers and you need a large set of products. For one to be able to create that both-sided effect, you need um, a critical mass on both sides, which again means a good amount of investment for one to be able to get to a stage where one um, starts looking at a place where they can start scaling up. And that is why a lot of filtering happens from setup to scale up. And that's where, what we have right now is more a survival bias than actually, how many people really want to set up platforms. A lot of what people want to set up platforms, only some of them are able to, but only a very few are able to scale up because of the cost that is involved and the overall capital that's involved.
At this point, I'd like you to notice that creating platform requires substantial upfront investments. This is about establishing legitimacy both on the demand and the supply side as well, which might require substantial investments, upfront investments. And Mr. Rakesh talks about this as creating this critical mass on either side. There are benefits of being a national player as opposed to a regional player, simply because being a national player might enable players to invest upfront in creating and legitimizing the platform, and also at the same time recouping these investments. If players or incumbents or companies cannot recoup the investments that they are incurring, they may not be willing to enter in the first place. And simply being a national player might enable or incentivize these companies to spend these upfront costs in the hope that they might be able to recover it. Entry based on noisy demand is also something that Mr. Rakesh essentially talks about, right? So even this idea of firms making these large upfront investments in the hope of succeeding in the markets gives you a sense that entry patterns or the entry of firms itself is based on demand that is essentially uncertain. And this points to this idea, right, going back to the theory, that entry might be based on expected demand or predicted demand rather than actually observing the demand prior to entry. Mr. Rakesh, what does it take for you to scale this business?
Uh, while it will be tough to sort of put a number behind it, but I can, of course, talk about different pillars that one organization needs to build to be able to scale up. Uh, I think the first and the foremost is having a very modular process. What I mean by that, modular process at multiple levels. If you look at um, the broader pillars of an organization, you will have people, process, technology. These are the three broader pillars. And it is each of these functions highly modular in nature, and hence your ability to expand from one module or one city to the other sort of grows exponentially the moment it is modular. What most of us tend to do is that, let me give an example. Let me actually make that very apparent with an example, right? Let's say if I want to start uh, food delivery in Delhi, and my service is targeted for a particular segment of type of restaurants and a type of customers. Uh, and if my whole product philosophy is centered around that, maybe my ability to expand into all different cities and identify similar customer and restaurant segments will always be a challenge. And that will make my ability to expand into other cities slightly harder than me, I as an organization taking a more core use case, which could be around, for example, that how do I solve delivery of ice creams and beverages, which is something that is more common thread, and it will be across different cities, valid in different cities and probably in different countries as well. So the moment I take a more modular problem statement and I design my solution around that, my ability to keep stacking up different cities as a module is much easier. So that is the first step towards that, is that identifying the right problem statement, which itself is modular in nature, right? That's one. Second, a very soft aspect, but a lot of organizations tend to sort of ignore that. If one is looking at India as a country to expand, no matter how modular you plan your processes to be, every state and every city is very, very different. And and hence, how do you balance that out by having the right local knowledge, the regional knowledge as well, is very important. So at one part, we are saying, how do you build a core process which is very modular? But at the same time, how do you keep layering it with regional nuances? Not only in terms of language capabilities, your supply capabilities, your demand capabilities, but also in terms of your own basic app content, for example. Is it regionalized in nature? Is your marketing more regionalized, right? Uh, does it cater to the local cults that are there, right? And so on and so forth, right? So that is the second part of the strategy, is that how do you think about different aspects of your brand, different aspects of your service, take small parts of that, regionalize it, make it locally relevant. I think these two are very, very important. And I think rest of the things you sort of build as a part of that and they work out fine.
Notice the use of the word modularity, right? Mr. Rakesh essentially talks about modularity quite a bit, and what he has in mind seems like it's the ability to pick segments that are national, that also gives the ability for incumbents to spread their upfront fixed costs that they might have to incur to legitimize the platform on both the demand as well as on the supply side. At the same time, he also talks about a very interesting trade-off. This is not to say, this idea of modularity is not to say that regionalization is not important or customization is not important, but the idea is to pick problems that give incumbents the ability to spread their fixed costs over a large amount of volume, and at the same time also provide for a little bit of customization. Mr. Rakesh, here is another question for you. How is the platform-based gig economy in India different from that in other parts of the world? Which kinds of experimentation and innovation have enabled it to adapt to the idiosyncrasies of India?
Sure. There are multiple facets of this, Anand, and let me first touch upon it from the gig workers aspect. Because if you look at the gig economy, there are multiple stakeholders. There are operators, which can be a restaurant, which could be a taxi operator, and so on and so forth. Whoever controls the supply side of it. There are, of course, consumers who are participating in the gig economy because they are the buyers, and also the gig workers. Let me take an example between two very similar economies, and I think that will give us a good juxtaposition of how India is very, very different. Um, Back in 2018, I had traveled to Philippines, and the task given to me was to launch Manila operations for Zomato. Right, so I had to sort of go around the city, figure what people like, what they don't like, what are the challenges, what service propositions will make sense. Very similarly, the way we did it in India, right? But here are a few clear differences that I saw in terms of how, let's say, a gig economy worker would operate in India across different cities and how one would operate in, let's say, Philippines or Manila, for example. Um, the first difference that I realized is, and this is barring, apart from language, because that's the obvious difference. Um, the first is that the disparity in India in terms of employment opportunities and education across cities and across countries is very high, right? And that itself is a big factor which determines the likelihood of someone wanting to be a part of gig economy, the motivations with which someone wants to be a part of the gig economy, and the shape and form in which one would become a part of the gig economy. So that's the first one. The level of education is very, very different. I'll, enunciate that with another example. And for example, if if we are launching, say, food delivery in um, tier 3 or tier 4 town in Bihar versus a tier 3, tier 4 town in Madhya Pradesh. Now, um, in Madhya Pradesh, for example, a lot of gig economy workers would, let's say, have easy access to a motorbike to become a food delivery uh, partner. They would also have all the necessary documentation along with that, which would mean insurance for the bike, which would mean their own driving license, which is updated, and so on and so forth. Right, but the same would not be the case in Bihar. Now, the same strategy that one would have adopted in Madhya Pradesh is not going to work in Bihar, right? So for you to be able to get the right kind of gig workers onboarded in Bihar, probably you'll have to do a number of trainings. Probably you'll have to do um, help them create the right documentation. They'll have to apply for their PAN cards. You'll have to make sure you have a help desk for them to be able to get their insurance queries answered and so on and so forth, right? And this is just one part of it, right? Someone who's a 10th pass in one state, their sort of basic, uh, I would say, learning outcomes would be very different from 10th pass in some other state, right? And hence, because of the differences that you see in these very basic primary um behaviors of people in different cities and states who might have necessarily the same qualification, the same asset, and the same motivation on paper, in actuality might be very, very different. And that makes it harder, but at the same time more unique as well, right, for India. Um, because what you might be solving for a gig worker in Madhya Pradesh and what you solve for a gig worker in Bihar is very, very different, right? You might be fundamentally solving the problem of employment for a gig worker in a city or a state X. And in the city Y, you might be actually just be an additional source of income for that person. This disparity that exists in India is very, very unique to India. And we see these differences actually at a locality level in our world, right? So I stay currently in Gurgaon. How a gig worker in Sector 54 of Gurgaon might behave versus how would a gig worker in Sector 14 would behave would be very different. And hence, how you approach them. What is your channel to incubate them? What is your channel to train them? What is your channel to motivate them will be very, very different. If you take the other part, and if you take the other economy that I was talking about, Philippines, for example, you would see a high level of uniformity in terms of motivations, in terms of skill levels. Not to say that their skill levels will be obviously better than ours, but it's a lot more uniform and hence more modularity.
Notice that heterogeneity is a huge challenge for some of these companies that operate in India. There are many kinds of heterogeneity, and what I think Mr. Rakesh speaks about is this idea of sub-national heterogeneity. Right? He even talks about heterogeneity between two areas even within the same city. And hence, this is likely to be a big challenge for incumbents that operate in India. A platform-based gig economy is likely to face challenges of heterogeneity, not just on one side, but on both sides as well, both on the demand as well as on the supply side. And what does this mean? There might be limits to the extent to which this entire process of scale up or standardization itself could be brought into the picture, right? And this might determine the extent of the mix between these large upfront costs and the ability to spread them across a large volume. For example, Mr. Rakesh talks about the training needs, the variation in training needs, and this might also mean that there might be limits to the extent of standardization in this industry. And if you think about it, given not only these large upfront investments in standardization, as well as these additional costs in customization, these itself could act as barriers to entry and might additionally explain industry concentration as well, and might explain why there are fewer opportunities maybe in this industry, maybe relative to others, to make profits.